The mission clock read 14:22 when everything went wrong. Captain Diana, Phoenix, Hartwell had flown hundreds of sorties across 3 decades, from the scorched skies of Desert Storm to the frozen corridors above the Arctic Circle, but nothing in her long career had prepared her for the silence that followed the last transmission from her squadron. One moment, 6 voices crackled through her helmet comms with the easy confidence of the best pilots in the Air Force. The next, there was nothing but static, a dead channel, and the scream of her F-35 Lightning II tearing through atmosphere thin as paper at 60,000 feet. She had survived wars, buried her father in his dress blues, and carried every loss the way combat veterans carry them, quietly, in the marrow. But she had always believed the enemy wore a uniform you could identify across the sky. That belief died the moment she realized the order that sent Ghost Wing into the kill zone had come from inside her own chain of command. Her body pressed hard against the ejection seat as the G-forces mounted. 5 GS, 6 GS. Her flight suit constricted around her legs and abdomen, forcing blood upward to her brain, fighting against the invisible weight that threatened to steal her consciousness. "Stay with me," she whispered, running the breathing sequence that had kept her functional through 8 years of extreme altitude flying. Inhale deep, hold, exhale slow through pursed lips. The horizon tilted as she banked hard, the edge of Russian airspace glowing red on her heads-up display. Inside her helmet, the augmented reality overlay projected mission data across her field of vision. Operation Black Shield, a standard reconnaissance run, gathering intelligence on suspected installations near the border. Her squadron, Ghost Wing, had run dozens of similar operations over 18 months. Nothing about this one had seemed unusual at the start. Ghost Lead to Ghost Squadron maintain formation and heading. ETA to Checkpoint Alpha, 3 minutes. Her voice was clean, carrying none of the strain coursing through her body. 6 acknowledgments crackled through her comms. The best the Air Force had. Each one selected after thousands of flight hours, relentless simulation, psychological profiling designed to identify pilots who stayed sharp when everything else fell apart. Ghost Wing operated at the bleeding edge of American air superiority, testing stealth technology, gathering intelligence that would never appear in official reports. "Phoenix, this is command. Authentication code Bravo Echo 79er. Proceed immediately to coordinates being uploaded to your navigation system." The transmission cut through her mission chatter without warning. Diana frowned behind her visor. Mid-mission redirects were rare this close to foreign airspace. "Command, Ghost Lead, confirm redirect authorization." "Confirmed, Phoenix, Priority Alpha, authentication verified through General Caldwell." Her jaw tightened. General Robert Caldwell had personally recruited her for Ghost Wing 4 years ago. If Caldwell was issuing direct orders mid-mission, something significant had changed on the ground. Uploading new flight path to squadron. Her fingers moved across the cockpit touchscreen. Ghost Squadron, new coordinates. Adjust heading to Vector 197. Maintain stealth protocols. The navigation system drew the new path. It took them deeper toward Russian airspace than their original parameters specified. Risk indicators flashed yellow across her display, not red enough to mandate abort, but enough to raise every instinct she owned. Something was wrong. The redirect pulled them away from their planned extraction corridor, stranding them with minimal fuel for the return journey. "Command, Ghost Lead, requesting verification. We are approaching restricted airspace with limited extraction options." Static answered her, then silence, no acknowledgement from command, no chatter from her squadron. "Ghost 2, radio check. Nothing. Ghost 3 through 7, radio check. Dead air." The electronic warfare alert screamed through her helmet. Hostile tracking systems locked. Impossible. The F-35 stealth architecture should have made them invisible to standard radar, unless someone had known exactly where to look. She initiated evasive maneuvers without conscious thought, hands moving through emergency protocols built into muscle memory over 8 years. The aircraft dropped into a steep dive. 7 GS, 8 GS. The edges of her vision darkened despite her suit and breathing technique. Through bursts of static, fragments of distress calls reached her pilots, voices she knew as well as her own, suddenly stripped of their trained calm. The words ambush and missile lock cut through before the channel died completely. Ghost Squadron abort mission, emergency protocols, return to. Her aircraft's electronics flickered. The control surfaces went sluggish, responding a half-second late. A sophisticated electronic attack was eating her fly-by-wire systems from the inside. She switched to manual override. The physical resistance in the control column intensified as hydraulic assistance failed. Her shoulders burned. Sweat ran freely despite the cockpit's climate control. She fought to keep the aircraft level while it tried to die around her. Altitude falling, 30,000 feet, 20,000. She pulled back against the stick with everything she had. Mayday, mayday, Ghost lead. Aircraft compromised, squadron status unknown. The ground rushed up. At 5,000 feet, she made the decision pilots train for and pray they never face. She aligned the crippled jet toward uninhabited terrain and found the ejection handle. The explosive bolts fired. Her world became noise and violence and spinning sky. The parachute snapped her upward. Then silence, the disorienting, total silence of open air after the roar of a dying jet engine. 2 miles away, her aircraft hit the ground and became a fireball that painted the twilight orange and red. Diana landed hard on frozen earth, the impact driving the air from her lungs. Training took over before conscious thought could. She shed the parachute and found cover, scanning the tree line with hands that did not shake. She was alone, enemy territory. No comms, no extraction plan, no word from 6 pilots who had trusted her with their lives. One thought took shape with the cold clarity that comes only when everything else has burned away. Someone had redirected Ghost Wing into a deliberate trap. Someone with high-level access to mission parameters and authentication codes. Someone inside her own chain of command. The bitter cold worked through her flight suit as she began moving toward the extraction corridor. Her mind kept returning to the final seconds before the channel went dead, replaying them, searching for the detail that would tell her who had done this and how far up the betrayal reached. She didn't have the answer yet, but she was going to find it. 72 hours of continuous interrogation will make even the strongest pilot question her own memory. Diana sat rigid in the metal chair, flight suit exchanged for standard-issue fatigues, eyes fixed on the mirrored glass of the observation room. The underground facility at Ramstein Air Base was built specifically for high-level security debriefings, its location classified even within military circles. The fluorescent lights never dimmed. Sleep deprivation is not technically torture under military protocols, but it works. Her mouth was dry, her eyes burning. Her posture stayed perfect. Colonel Frank Hartwell's daughter did not show weakness to men who had already decided what they thought of her. The door opened, and General Robert Caldwell walked in. 60 years old, Gulf War combat veteran, silver hair cropped close, uniform immaculate despite the hour. He had been her father's wingman in Desert Storm. He had pinned captain's bars on her uniform. He had hand-selected her for Ghost Wing. The lines around his eyes had deepened considerably in the 3 days since her recovery. Captain Hartwell, gravel and steel, the voice of a man who had spent 30 years shouting over jet engines. "Let's go through this one more time." "Sir, my statement hasn't changed because it's the truth." Caldwell set a folder on the table between them. 7 pilots missing. 7 advanced aircraft destroyed. The worst aviation disaster in recent classified history, and you're the only one who walked away. He let the silence do the rest of the work. "I did not compromise this mission. Ghost Wing was deliberately redirected into an ambush." "By whom, Captain? You led the squadron, all communications routed through you." "The redirect order carried proper authentication codes. It was verified as originating directly from you, sir." Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "I issued no such order." "Then someone with access to your authentication protocols did." The silence stretched between them. Caldwell studied her face with the patience of a man who had learned to read people in cockpits and interrogation rooms. Diana held his gaze. She had known this man most of her adult life. If she could not trust Robert Caldwell, she had no footing left to stand on. "We recovered your flight recorder," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "The redirect order was authenticated using Colonel Raymond Forsyth's command codes." It hit her like a physical strike. Forsyth had mentored her since flight school. He had guided every step of her career, advocated for her advancement, stood at her father's graveside, and promised to look after Frank Hartwell's daughter. "That's not possible," she said, and heard the first crack in her composure as she said it. "Colonel Forsyth would never." Colonel Forsyth submitted retirement papers 2 days after Ghost Wing disappeared. Caldwell's face was grim. "He's gone, Diana. No forwarding address. No contact with family. Military intelligence cannot locate him." She understood the implication. If Forsyth had betrayed them, sold Ghost Wing to a foreign power, then everything she had built her understanding of military service on was foundationless. The loyalty, the hierarchy of trust, the certainty that the people above her in the chain were bound by the same code she was. All of it sand. "I want to see the flight recorder data." "That won't be possible. The investigation is classified at the highest levels." She leaned forward. "Sir, if Colonel Forsyth compromised Ghost Wing, I need to understand why. I owe that to my pilots." "Your pilots are presumed dead, Captain, and until we determine your role in this, you're on administrative leave." The words landed like hammer blows. Administrative leave was the military's waiting room for careers that were already over. Not formally punished, but removed, suspended above the void on the thinnest possible thread. "I did not betray my squadron," she said, each word measured, deliberate. "I would die before I betrayed a fellow pilot." Caldwell picked up the folder and stood. For a moment, only a moment, something that resembled genuine regret moved across his features. "I put you in Ghost Wing because you fly like your father. Same instincts, same nerve." He paused at the door. "But Frank would have seen this coming. That's the difference." The door closed. The room was very quiet. Diana sat alone with what remained of her career and a question that would follow her for years. Whether Caldwell had meant that as a condemnation or, in some way she couldn't yet parse, as a clue. The Nevada desert looked like the surface of a dead planet from the transport aircraft window. Stonegate Air Force Base occupied a shallow valley between 2 ridgelines, its tarmac bleached by sun, its prefabricated buildings showing the slow decay of facilities the Pentagon prefers not to acknowledge. Even from altitude, it had the unmistakable look of a place things are sent to be forgotten. Stonegate existed in the margins of military bureaucracy, absent from recruitment materials, press briefings, and budget hearings. It held officers who could not be court-martialed, but could not be trusted with sensitive postings, pilots who had made politically awkward mistakes, analysts whose findings had inconvenienced powerful people. It was the Air Force's version of a locked drawer. 3 months had passed since Ghost Wing. 3 months of interrogations, psychological evaluations, and the careful institutional process of converting an active investigation into a quietly closed file. No formal charges, no official reprimand in her service record, just transfer orders and the unspoken understanding that her career would end here, in the heat and the silence of the Mojave. The cargo ramp lowered to reveal Major Dennis Prout waiting on the tarmac, her new commanding officer, base operations director, the man who would decide what Hugh Stonegate could make of a grounded fighter pilot with a compromised reputation. He was 40, soft around the middle in ways that came from desk hours rather than neglect, his uniform sun-faded but regulation. Diana descended the ramp and rendered a precise salute. "Captain Diana Hartwell, reporting for duty, sir." Prout returned it with noticeably less precision. "At ease, we're informal here." His eyes moved across her face with the frank assessment of a man who had been briefed. "The Black Phoenix, that's what some circles are calling you." The nickname stung, Black for betrayal, Phoenix for sole survivor. "I prefer Captain Hartwell, sir." Noted, a thin smile. "Quarters in Building C. You start tomorrow, 700, flight operations. Given your background, we've placed you in air traffic control rather than active duty." The message required no interpretation. The cockpit was gone. "Understood, sir." "People here know your story or think they do. Keep to yourself until the curiosity runs down." Prout glanced at his watch and was already elsewhere. "Duty sergeant will take it from here. Welcome to Stonegate." As he walked away, Diana registered the ground crew watching from a distance. Their expressions told the familiar story, the survivor who shouldn't have survived alone. In the brutal arithmetic of military brotherhood, breathing when everyone else had stopped was its own kind of accusation. Her quarters in Building C were everything she had expected. Institutional beige walls, vinyl floor worn through its pattern, a bed, a desk, a chair, a narrow closet, one window overlooking gravel. Clean but impersonal, the room of someone the facility expected to pass through. She knew better. People sent to Stonegate did not pass through. They faded. She unpacked with the methodical attention to order that years of flight prep had made involuntary. Uniforms in the closet, personal items on the desk surface, each in its assigned place. From the side pocket of her duffel, she withdrew the one thing she would not leave in storage, her father's pilot chronograph. Stainless steel, scratched from years on his wrist through combat sorties above Iraq and Kuwait. The leather strap was worn smooth. Colonel Frank Hartwell had given it to her the morning she earned her wings, pressed it into her palm without ceremony, as if passing something much heavier than a watch. She set it carefully on the desk. Then she sat on the bed and let the weight of the past 3 months settle fully onto her for the first time, now that there was no official procedure left to maintain posture for. 7 pilots gone. Her career finished. Her name turned into a byword for catastrophe, and the truth about Ghost Wing, the real truth, still buried somewhere she had not yet found. She made a promise in that quiet room to herself and to the memory of the 6 voices she would never hear on comms again. She would find the answer, not for redemption, not even for justice in any legal sense, but because pilots do not abandon their wingmen. Not during the mission and not after it ends. That promise became the only fixed point in the darkness that followed. The Air Traffic Control Center at Stonegate used equipment that belonged in an aviation museum. Analog radar displays, communication systems running decade-old encryption, computers whose operating software had not been updated since the second Bush administration. The technology matched the facility's purpose: old, overlooked, maintained just enough to function. 2 weeks into her assignment, Diana had established a functional routine. She arrived on time, performed her duties without error, and spoke when operations demanded it. Her supervisors noted her efficiency with the grudging approval of people who had expected worse. Her fellow controllers kept their distance, conversations stopping at her entrance to the break room like a song hitting a wrong note. The night shift suited her on every practical level. Fewer personnel, reduced flight operations, and most useful extended windows of access to communication systems with minimal oversight. Delta 79er Stonegate Control, maintain heading 180, cleared for approach, runway 3. Her voice was neutral as she guided a cargo transport through its sequence. Across the dim control room, Technical Sergeant Briggs yawned openly. Last inbound for 2 hours minimum. Coffee run. You want anything, Captain? No thank you, Sergeant. Briggs shrugged and left. Diana turned immediately to the secondary communication console, the encrypted military transmission system. For 2 weeks, she had been working methodically through its security architecture during these small windows of solitude, probing for paths into classified networks that might contain records of Ghost Wing's final mission. She had learned these techniques during electronic warfare training. The system was not designed to resist a user who already held legitimate access credentials and knew how authorization layers were structured. Within minutes, she had established a connection to a military database operating several tiers above her clearance level. Search parameters, Operation Blackshield, Ghost Wing, Colonel Raymond Forsyth, authentication protocols. The aging processors labored. When the results appeared, she held her breath. A single file, communication logs from the day of the ambush. She downloaded it to a secure portable drive and cleared the query from system memory. As she closed the connection, an unfamiliar string of characters scrolled across the bottom of the screen, a code sequence that did not belong to any standard military protocol she recognized. She copied it to a text file before the display cleared. The door swung open. Briggs returned with 2 cups of coffee, one of which he set beside her station without comment. Been meaning to ask, he said, settling back at his post. The Ghost Wing rumors, how much of it is true? Which rumors are those, Sergeant? That you were set up, that someone with rank wanted Ghost Wing gone. He met her cautious look steadily. Base like this, people talk. Most of us landed here because we asked the wrong questions or trusted someone we shouldn't have. Before she could answer, the door opened again. Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Ashby entered, Stonegate's cybersecurity specialist, a man she had registered peripherally as one of the base's few apparent professionals rather than its exiles. His presence in flight operations at this hour was unusual. Captain Hartwell, a word. She followed him to the adjacent office. He was 45, compact, with the quiet self-assurance of someone whose value was technical and specific. He closed the door. Your father was Frank Hartwell, he said without preliminary. The flying colonel, 30 combat missions over Iraq, Distinguished Flying Cross, Desert Storm. Yes, sir. My brother flew with him, Thomas Ashby, a pause that carried weight. Thomas spoke about your father's integrity more than he spoke about almost anything else. He trusted that standard carried forward. Another pause. Thomas was part of Ghost Wing. He's been missing for 3 months. Diana absorbed this. Of all the people she might have found at Stonegate, a direct family connection to her lost squadron had not entered her calculations. I didn't know. I'm sorry about your brother, Colonel. The official account says Ghost Wing was lost to pilot error or equipment failure. His voice held no anger, only the controlled flatness of a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long. "I don't believe you caused this, Captain." She studied him. "Why not? Everyone else does." "Because I've been tracking a series of security breaches in military communication systems. Breaches that began approximately 6 weeks before Ghost Wing disappeared and have not stopped." He lowered his voice. "Someone has been accessing classified authentication protocols using codes that should have been decommissioned years ago." She thought of the unfamiliar sequence she had just copied from the console. What kind of codes? Cold War failsafes. Emergency command structures designed for worst-case scenarios, command decapitation, nuclear exchange, total communications breakdown. He glanced at the door. "I believe those structures were exploited to override Ghost Wing's mission parameters by someone with deep institutional knowledge and the authority to invoke protocols that no one in current operations would recognize as irregular." Colonel Forsyth. Possibly, or possibly Forsyth discovered the breach and became a liability because of it. Ashby set a small data drive on the desk. "These are the communication logs I've recovered. Study them carefully and tell no one. If I'm right about who's behind this, they have significant reach inside military intelligence." "Why bring me into this?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because my brother trusted you with his life. Because 7 people deserve the truth." He moved to the door, then stopped. "And because you've been accessing the same classified systems I've been monitoring for 2 weeks. We're hunting the same answers, Captain. It makes more sense to hunt together." After he left, Diana sat motionless with the drive in her palm, feeling the shift in her circumstances as clearly as a change in air pressure before a storm. For the first time since the desert, she was not alone. Sleep became a liability. The data Ashby had provided, combined with what she had pulled herself, formed a pattern that kept her awake through the pre-dawn hours in a way no amount of discipline could override. Her father's watch read 5:27 when she leaned back from the desk and rubbed her eyes. The wall above the desk had been transformed. Printed documents, handwritten notes, physical connections drawn in red pen between data points. Her father had worked this way, analog, irreducible. "They can hack your computer," he used to say. "They have to burn your house down to destroy paper." At the center of everything, the name Project Zodiac. It appeared in the recovered logs like a fault line running under the surface, always in connection with high-level authentication activity, never explained, never attributed to any current program office. The limited data suggested it was a classified operation from the early post-Cold War period, sealed behind clearance levels that didn't formally exist on any organizational chart she had access to. The connection to Ghost Wing was still implied rather than proven, but certain logs suggested the squadron's reconnaissance runs had been directed, without their knowledge, toward assets and activities connected to Zodiac. A program that officially no longer existed, generating enough activity to require sophisticated surveillance. A knock at her door. She covered the board with a sheet, checked through the peephole, and opened it to find Ashby in the hallway, his expression stripped of its usual composure. "Not here," he said quietly. 20 minutes later they sat in his vehicle at the remote northeastern corner of the base perimeter, the engine off, the desert still cool before the day's heat took hold. "I've found the transmission pattern," Ashby said, handing her a printed timeline. "The security intrusions correspond directly to Ghost Wing's operational calendar, 18 months of mission scheduling, matched beat for beat. Someone was tracking your squadron's movements and feeding that data outward through encrypted channels." Diana studied the timeline. The correlation was too precise to be coincidence. These transmissions originated inside our network. inside the secure communication infrastructure for Ghost Wing specifically. This was not an external breach. Someone with direct operational access was running a parallel reporting channel. Have you identified the source? Not to a single individual. The outbound traffic was routed through multiple proxy layers with military-grade encryption. He paused. But I've narrowed the access tier. Whoever did this held Phantom clearance. Phantom, the highest tier classification in the Air Force's Black Operations framework, reserved for officers with direct authority over programs that did not officially exist. Very few personnel below the rank of colonel held it. Forsyth had Phantom, she said, as did General Caldwell and 3 other officers with direct oversight of Ghost Wing. Ashby's voice remained level, including Thomas's direct superior, Colonel Victor Harlan. I don't know that name. You wouldn't. Former test pilot, grounded after a training accident in the late 90s, moved into intelligence operations. Currently holds the position of Strategic Operations Director at the Pentagon. Ashby handed her a personnel profile. His name appears in several of the few accessible references to Project Zodiac from its operational period. Diana studied the photograph. Angular face, hard eyes, the compressed expression of a man who had learned to reveal nothing. Something about the set of his jaw nagged at her, not recognition exactly, but a sense that she had encountered this type before. The kind of officer who understood that the machinery of power required maintenance that did not appear in any official maintenance log. If Harlan compromised Ghost Wing, what was the objective? What was worth 7 pilots and the exposure of a classified operation? That's where the documented trail ends. Zodiac's core parameters are buried under access tiers I can't reach. Ashby checked his watch. There's something I need to show you in person. Can you meet me at the secure archive facility tonight, 2300 hours, Section C, Sublevel 3? I'll be there. He gripped her arm briefly before she opened the car door. Captain, if my working theory about Zodiac is correct, we're not investigating a personnel betrayal. We're looking at something with strategic implications far beyond Ghost Wing. The kind of secret that people in positions of genuine power will kill to protect. I'm already classified as a traitor, she said. I don't have much left to lose. That, he said, is exactly what worries me. The archive facility stood separate from Stonegate's main structures, a windowless concrete block ringed by security checkpoints, its purpose undiscoverable from its exterior. During operational hours, it stored classified documentation related to the base's various research programs. After hours, a single guard monitored the entrance with the focus of a man who had held this post long enough to believe nothing interesting ever happened here. Diana approached from the east side, using the shadow lines of maintenance buildings to minimize her exposure to camera coverage. Ashby had provided temporary credentials for the lower-level access points. She used her standard base credentials at the entrance, a routine late return to nothing specific, should anyone review the logs. The guard was watching basketball. He processed her ID with his attention mostly elsewhere. She took the elevator to Sublevel 3. Section C was a maze of locked storage rooms under fluorescent lighting that flickered in patterns designed, it seemed, to prevent any settled sense of security. At the end of the main corridor, Ashby waited beside an unmarked door, his posture carrying a tension she had not seen in him before. You're 2 minutes late. Random vehicle inspections at the residential checkpoint. She kept her voice low. What is this section? Cold storage for materials deemed obsolete but too sensitive for standard archiving procedures. He entered a long access code into the electronic lock. Decommissioned bases, terminated programs, Their most classified materials end up in facilities like this, officially forgotten, never actually deleted. The lock released. The room beyond was large and cold, filing cabinets in rows, storage containers stacked to the ceiling, the smell of preserved paper and magnetic media from an era before everything went digital. "How did you find this place?" Thomas told me where to look. In our last conversation before Ghost Wing disappeared, he said that if anything happened to him, I should look for answers in the place where dead projects go to sleep. A beat of silence. It took me 5 weeks to understand what he meant. They moved through the rows. Ashby stopped at a section of cabinets marked with faded classification designations from the mid-90s. These contain fragmentary records from early post-Soviet programs, including partial references to Zodiac. He removed a folder and placed it on a work surface between 2 cabinets. Inside were technical schematics, faded with age, annotated in a hand that had clearly understood what it was drawing. Ghost Wing was not running standard reconnaissance, he said. They were specifically tasked with surveillance of activities connected to advanced weapons technology that originated with Project Zodiac and may have recently reappeared in the hands of foreign state actors. Diana studied the schematics, guidance system architecture, hypersonic application parameters. The diagrams were 30 years old, but the underlying engineering spoke for itself. What was Zodiac? Hypersonic missile technology developed a full generation before any publicly acknowledged program. Ashby turned pages carefully. Technology that violated multiple international treaties by its existence. The program was officially terminated in 1997 after a catastrophic test failure killed 3 engineers. All research materials were supposedly destroyed. Supposedly. The most valuable research was preserved in a hardened data vault, a facility designated Vault Omega. He met her eyes, located directly beneath Stonegate Air Force Base. For 3 seconds she said nothing. Then I was sent here deliberately, not as punishment. As a controlled asset, Ashby agreed quietly. Someone knows you're investigating Ghost Wing's disappearance. They want to manage what you find and when. The alarm started before she could respond. Red emergency lighting pulsed through the corridor outside. The automated system announced a security breach in Section C and ordered immediate evacuation. Ashby's expression moved through surprise, calculation, and something close to fear in rapid sequence. This is not automated. Someone is in the base security system right now. They've seen our access signatures. How? The guard barely. Because someone with administrative access to security monitoring just flagged our credentials in real time. He shoved the folder into his jacket. We move now. The corridor had transformed, lights strobing, security doors beginning their sequential closure, the sound of personnel mobilizing several floors above them. They ran for the main elevator. Diana swiped the temporary credentials through the reader. Red light. Denied. She tried again. Already locked out, she turned. Alternative route. Maintenance stairwell. Far end of Section B, emergency evacuation bypass. It routes around the main checkpoints. They changed direction, moving hard through the narrowing network of corridors as blast doors sealed off sections behind them. The stairwell access panel showed green when they reached it. Ashby pushed through. Diana followed. The lights went out completely, not the staged failure of a power fluctuation, but the total, instantaneous darkness of deliberate shutdown. The emergency generators did not engage. Someone had isolated them. She felt the displacement of air before anything else, the subtle pressure change that means another person is moving in your space. Training drove her body before thought could. She dropped and rotated, and the impact she would have taken to the head passed through the air above her. A trained fighter. The movement patterns belonged to close-quarters military instruction, not security protocol. This person had been placed here specifically, had known they would come this way. They exchanged strikes in near-total darkness, Diana working from contact and spatial memory, using the attacker's momentum whenever she could find it. A blow to her ribs hit hard enough to compromise her next 2 breaths. Then she found the attacker's knife hand coming in, captured the wrist with both of hers, and used the committed forward force to destroy the shoulder joint. The knife hit the floor. A strike to the base of the skull ended the engagement. She took the knife, checked the attacker's clothing. No identification of any kind. Military-issue combat uniform, unmarked. The anonymity was itself information. This was not base security. This was someone assigned specifically to silence anyone who reached this section. She rejoined Ashby in the stairwell, breathing controlled. "Injured?" he asked, reading her posture. "Functional, keep moving." They climbed fast. Security teams were audible above them, converging on the archive building in response to the breach alert. The maintenance exit deposited them near the northeastern perimeter fence, away from the main response vectors, in the shadow of a maintenance depot. Alarm sirens continued across the base, vehicle engines, radio traffic. "We separate here," Ashby said, already running the calculation. "Return through the residential maintenance access. I'll draw their attention toward the administrative sector." He handed her a copy of the documents he'd taken from the archive. "If we're questioned, we were never here." He gripped her shoulder for a moment. "Whoever is running this has operational reach we've only begun to map. Be careful, Captain." She was about to answer when the ground shifted. Not dramatically, not an earthquake, but a deep, structural vibration rising from somewhere far below the surface, as if the geology itself had remembered something. The alarms changed tone, not the sharp pulse of a security breach, something lower, slower, more fundamental, base-wide. "What is that?" Diana asked. Ashby had gone very still. His face in the emergency lighting carried an expression she had not seen on him before, the look of a man whose calculation has just been overturned by a fact he cannot immediately accommodate. "That's coming from the deep storage sectors," he said, "from below the classified infrastructure." His voice was almost inaudible. "Vault Omega is activating." A second tremor moved through the ground, deeper than the first. Across the base, new alarm systems joined the existing ones in a cascading response that told her this was not a localized event. "This isn't coincidence," she said. "No," his eyes found hers. "Someone else has been investigating Project Zodiac, someone who just located what they were looking for." He paused. "Or someone who wanted us to be here when it was found." The base was in full emergency response around them, organized, rapid, the disciplined chaos of trained personnel responding to an event outside normal parameters. In the middle of it, Diana stood with a dead attacker's knife in her jacket, and the slowly forming understanding that the hunt for Ghost Wing's truth had just opened a door she had not known existed. Whatever was waking up beneath Stonegate had been sleeping since 1997, and whoever had woken it had known exactly what they were doing. The command center at Stonegate had shifted from its usual low-energy night configuration to something close to controlled crisis. Every communication station was active. Personnel who should have been off-duty were at their posts in various stages of dress. Base Commander General Wallace Oakes stood at the central monitoring array, his face illuminated by the amber glow of emergency displays, looking like a man who had expected to finish his military career in comfortable obscurity, and had just been informed that was no longer an option. 62 years old, career artillery officer who had pivoted to Air Operations Command in the mid-90s, Oakes had been sent to Stonegate 18 months earlier for reasons that were politely described in his transfer documentation as administrative redeployment. He was competent, thorough, and had accepted Stonegate as the final chapter of a long career without excessive bitterness. He was not equipped for what his monitors were now showing him. Someone explained to me how a facility that does not officially exist just activated every alarm system on this base, he said. His voice was steady. The expression was not. Major Prout worked a tablet displaying real-time status alerts. Sir, the activation sequence initiated at 2:17. Multiple systems coming online simultaneously. Environmental controls, security protocols, biometric authentication interfaces, data integrity monitors. Source of activation. That's the problem, sir. Internal logs show the activation originated from inside the vault, as if the facility's own systems triggered the startup sequence autonomously. A facility that has been in minimal maintenance dormancy since 1997 does not activate autonomously, Major. No, sir. Nevertheless, that's what the logs show. Prout hesitated. There's a secondary issue. The startup sequence is requesting specific authentication credentials. Credentials linked to a program designation I don't have clearance to query. Project Zodiac. The name produced a silence that moved through the command center like a pressure wave. Even here, among officers whose careers had been built on navigating the classified infrastructure of American military power, Zodiac carried the weight of something no one wanted to touch. Patch me through to Pentagon Strategic Command. Authorization Sierra Echo 9-5 Tango. While the connection was being established, Oakes turned to his security officer. Full base lockdown. No movement without my personal authorization. He scanned the room. And find Captain Hartwell. I want her in this building in the next 15 minutes. Diana came through her residential maintenance access point, changed into uniform, and was composing her expression into its most neutral configuration when the knock came. 2 MPs and Colonel Victor Harlan in the corridor. She recognized the name from Ashby's profile. Seeing the face for the first time confirmed the photograph had not flattered or distorted him. Angular, controlled, precise in the way of someone who had decided a long time ago that precision was the only reliable defense. Captain Hartwell, you'll come with us to command. Of course, sir. May I ask? The matter is classified. Bring your ID. She reached for the desk. Her father's watch sat in its usual place. She picked it up with the natural movement of someone doing what they always do and slipped it into her pocket. If Harlan clocked it, nothing in his face acknowledged the fact. The walk to command produced the usual Stonegate spectacle: personnel responding to emergency stations, curious eyes following a captain escorted by MPs, and a colonel whose presence this far from the Pentagon required explanation. Diana held her posture and her pace and did not look at anyone. In the command center, Oakes turned from his monitors when they entered, and the brief recalibration of his expression told her he had already formed a theory about her involvement. Captain Hartwell, you accessed the secure archive facility approximately 90 minutes ago. Explain your purpose. Sir, I was conducting research related to historical flight pattern analysis. Major Prout authorized my access to Archive Section C for a comparative study project. Major Prout has no record of issuing that authorization, Harlan said. He had positioned himself at a slight angle from Oakes, not quite behind him, but close enough to function as a second voice without appearing to override command authority. A practiced arrangement. Sir, I have the signed authorization in my quarters. I can provide it. Oakes and Harlan exchanged a look, the kind that happens between people who have discussed the relevant subject before the meeting began. Captain, Oakes said, his voice lowering, approximately 70 minutes ago, a storage facility classified above the top-secret tier initiated a full automated startup sequence. The timing corresponds exactly to your presence in the archive. I need you to understand how that looks. I understand how it looks, sir. I also know that I have no knowledge of any facility called Vault Omega and no access capability that could trigger an automated startup in a system sealed for nearly 30 years. And yet the archive access logs show specific queries against files connected to Project Zodiac, Harlan said, a program directly linked to Vault Omega's security architecture. Sir, if those logs show Zodiac queries under my credentials, the logs have been manipulated. A claim we cannot verify in the time available to us. Harlan stepped forward slightly. Because in 48 minutes, if Vault Omega's systems don't receive valid authentication, Pentagon Strategic Command Standing Protocol is Directive 17, controlled demolition of all classified contents. The Directive 17 announcement killed every other conversation in the room. It was the endpoint that no one wanted to reach, the protocol that meant the facility's contents were considered more dangerous than their absence. Timeframe confirmed, sir, the lieutenant at the communications station said. Pentagon is standing by for authentication confirmation within that window. Oakes looked at Harlan. The unspoken communication between them was clear to Diana. Whatever was happening here, it was already beyond standard command resolution. The Vault's security systems run on Zodiac authentication architecture, Harlan said to Oakes, his tone that of someone presenting a brief position. Current personnel lack the necessary credentials for manual override. He turned to Diana. However, Captain Hartwell accessed archive files containing Zodiac security parameters, and there is a secondary factor. He let the pause do its work. Her father. Harlan laid it out with the methodical patience of someone who had rehearsed the briefing. Colonel Frank Hartwell had not been only a combat pilot and a training officer. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, he had served as a classified security consultant to Project Zodiac, his expertise in advanced aerial combat informing the program's defensive application parameters. This service had never appeared in any official record. It had been compartmentalized within Zodiac itself, accessible only to personnel with direct program authority. Diana held the silence that followed. Her father had spoken of his career with the selective candor of a man who understood the difference between what could be shared and what could not. She had never pressed for more than he offered. She had understood, without it being stated, that some rooms were locked for reasons that had nothing to do with distrust between them. She had not known about this room. His contribution to Zodiac included integration into the program's security architecture, Harlan continued. Zodiac's access protocols, unlike most contemporary systems, included a genetic recognition parameter. The reasoning was straightforward for the period. A biological credential cannot be copied, lost, or coerced in the conventional sense. Authorized personnel were registered. The system was designed with a single inheritance tier. Direct descendants of registered personnel would carry sufficient genetic markers for partial authentication. He met her eyes. The system was updated in 1994, 2 years after your birth was registered in federal records, to include you as a Tier 1 derivative credential for Colonel Hartwell's access node. This was the piece Harlan had prepared most carefully. Diana could see the architecture of it, the explanation calibrated to close off the obvious objection before she could voice it. The vault's designers had not been programming for a contingency they expected to need. They had been building a failsafe for a failsafe, the kind of redundant inheritance logic that Cold War engineers applied to systems they expected might outlast their authorized operators by decades. Partial authentication, she said carefully. What does the system require beyond genetic verification? Retinal pattern recognition, and a command code component. Harlan's gaze moved briefly, controlled but unmistakably, to her jacket pocket. Zodiac's secondary access layer was embedded in physical objects carried by authorized personnel. The practice was common in that generation of black program architecture. A credential that couldn't be extracted from a database, couldn't be phished, couldn't be obtained without physical possession of the object and knowledge of how to activate it. 43 minutes on the countdown clock. Oakes spoke before she could. Captain Hartwell, I'm not in a position to evaluate the full operational history of what Harlan is describing. What I can evaluate is this. We have a classified facility entering automated demolition protocol in under an hour, and you may be the only person on this base with any possibility of accessing its authentication system. Whatever personal reservations you have about this situation, I need you to set them aside. Sir, if the vault's contents are relevant to Ghost Wing, I need to understand the connection before I agree to participate in any procedure related to this facility. Harlan spoke. Ghost Wing's final mission was not standard reconnaissance. The squadron was tasked with surveillance of foreign state activities that indicated acquisition of Zodiac-derived technology that was supposed to have been destroyed in 1997 and had apparently been transferred through unofficial channels. He held her gaze steadily. The connection between Zodiac and Ghost Wing is direct and specific. The vault may contain documentation of that connection. It was either the truth or a precisely constructed version of the truth designed to ensure her cooperation. She couldn't determine which from inside the command center, with a countdown running and Harlan's security team at the door. What she could determine was that refusing would close every door. Proceeding kept at least some of them open. I'll do what I can, sir, she told Oakes. You have 41 minutes, Oakes said. Colonel Harlan has operational authority over the vault access procedure. Follow his lead. As Harlan organized his security team, 4 individuals whose bearing and equipment marked them immediately as special operations rather than base security. Diana scanned the command center one more time for Ashby. He was not there. His absence registered as either good or bad depending on factors she could not yet evaluate. Harlan returned to her side. His expression had shifted from the careful neutrality of a command briefing to something flatter and more direct. Time to go, Captain. The descent to Sector 9 required 4 separate elevator systems, each requiring different security credentials, each depositing them in a corridor of slightly older and less familiar architecture than the last. Harlan operated every access point without hesitation or visible reference to any document. His familiarity with a facility he had no official connection to was, by itself, significant information. The security team moved with the compact efficiency of people who had trained together and did not need to talk about what they were doing. Diana cataloged them as she walked. None had standard base security insignia. Their equipment included items not issued to military police. At least 2 carried sidearms supplemented by equipment she recognized from Special Operations Readiness inspections, the kind of personnel selected not for visibility but for capability and discretion. The vault was constructed in 1982 as a hardened data storage facility, Harlan said, as the final elevator descended past the lowest numbered sublevel into depth that appeared nowhere on the base's official schematic. The air changed as they dropped, colder, stiller, carrying the faint electrical smell of systems that had recently woken after a long sleep. repurposed for Zodiac materials in 1991. The engineering was Soviet-era influenced, physical redundancy over electronic elegance. They built things to last in that period, not to be convenient. And after Zodiac officially ended, decommissioned in the operational sense, maintained at minimal function through automated processes, environmental controls cycling seasonally, diagnostic routines running on isolated power cells. The intent was preservation without human access, a closed archive. Until tonight. Until tonight. The elevator stopped. The doors opened onto a corridor unlike anything in the standard base infrastructure. Curved metal walls, highly polished, reflecting the emergency lighting in duplicated amber lines. The air was noticeably cold, climate control functioning after 3 decades, maintaining precisely the conditions its designers had specified for long-term storage. Every few meters, a dormant security station had come to life, its screens running startup diagnostics in the phosphor green of very old display technology. At the end of the corridor, the vault door occupied the entire terminal wall. There was no other way to describe it except as an artifact of a different era's philosophy. Massive, uncompromising, built on the assumption that physical resistance was the ultimate security. Steel-reinforced concrete framing, mechanical bolt systems backed by electronic locks, a design that assumed the threat would eventually arrive in person and should find something that did not move. Adjacent to the door, a newer security station had been installed at some point after the vault's original construction. More recent hardware interfaced with the older authentication systems, a patch that connected modern monitoring capability to Cold War-era access controls. 31 minutes, Harlan noted, checking the countdown display on the newer station. The startup sequence has progressed through environmental and structural diagnostics. The authentication protocol is active and waiting. Biometric authentication protocol, standing by. The automated system confirmed through hidden speakers. The voice was the flat, precise delivery of a synthesized system from the 1990s, slightly uncanny in the cold air. Primary access requires genetic verification from registered Zodiac personnel or registered Tier 1 derivative. Retinal pattern confirmation and command code component required for full authorization. Harlan gestured toward the biometric scanner beside the vault's primary interface. Genetic scan first. Diana removed the watch and set it in her jacket pocket. She would need both hands free, and she wanted it accessible rather than on her wrist. She pressed her palm flat against the scanner surface. The embedded sensors mapped vascular architecture and cellular structure. Blue light tracked patterns across her skin. After approximately 8 seconds, the display shifted. Partial genetic authentication confirmed. Tier 1 derivative credential recognized. The automated voice. Secondary verification required to complete access authorization. The system recognizes your genetic relationship to Colonel Hartwell, Harlan said. It needs the code component to complete the sequence. He did not look at her pocket. He had controlled that particular tell since the command center, but the absence of the look was its own kind of look. Diana withdrew the chronograph. She turned it in her hands, the scratched case she had carried since her winging ceremony, the worn leather strap that held the shape of her father's wrist. She had never looked at it as anything other than what it appeared to be. Now she turned the crown to its time-setting position and rotated it counterclockwise, against the instinctive direction, the direction no one adjusting time would choose. A small, precise click came from inside the mechanism. The case back separated along a seam she had never seen before, invisible at normal attention, engineered to be found only by someone who knew exactly where to apply pressure. A concealed compartment beneath the movement. Inside it, a metallic disc the size of a shirt button, its surface etched with an alphanumeric sequence too fine to read without magnification. She set the disc on the receptor plate beside the retinal scanner and positioned her eye against the scanner housing. The authentication system processed the dual input. Something old and large and mechanical began to move inside the vault door. "Authentication complete," the automated voice said. "Welcome, Zodiac Clearance Designate." The bolt system retracted over approximately 40 seconds, each heavy cylinder withdrawing in sequence, the sound traveling through the floor as much as through the air. Hydraulics engaged. The vault door, which Diana estimated at several tons of reinforced steel and concrete composite, began its outward arc with a deliberateness that made clear it had been designed to be opened exactly once per generation if necessary, and to be still standing after that generation had passed. The interior appeared as the door cleared its frame. She had been prepared for record storage. What she saw instead was a research installation from another era, preserved intact. Workstations from 3 decades of computing technology, the older units clustered toward the far wall and the more recent toward the entrance, suggesting periodic updates had been made to working areas while the older equipment had been archived in place. Glass-enclosed environmental chambers along the south wall held materials in conditions designed for long-term preservation. In the center of the space, a prototype demonstration area occupied what would have been the laboratory's primary testing zone, its purpose clearer from its configuration than from any label. And in the geometric center of the room, elevated on a dedicated containment platform with its own secondary locking system, a single reinforced case with scorched emblems partially visible through oxidation and heat damage. Ghost Wing Squadron markings, her unit's designator. She crossed to it before Harlan could redirect her attention. The case's secondary electronic lock was offline, its power cell drained in the general systems failure that had followed the emergency lighting cutover. The mechanical backup responded to the same techniques she had used on the archive cabinet. The seals released with a pressure differential hiss. Inside, documentation, data drives, printed records, evidence filed and organized by someone who had understood they were assembling a record that might be the only one. "Step back from that, Captain." Harlan had moved across the room without her registering it. He held his sidearm in a two-hand grip, aimed at center mass, his expression showing none of the controlled professional management that had characterized the previous hour. What was underneath the management was colder and more specific. "Put it down and move to the far wall." She did not move. "How long have you known it was here?" "Long enough. Move to the wall." "My squadron was in that case before I ever came to Stonegate." She held the case, watching him. "You positioned me here. You managed this entire sequence, the transfer, the archive access, the vault activation. You needed my genetics and you needed me to come to this room. I needed the vault opened." His voice was still flat, professional in its way, the tone of someone executing a function rather than making a personal choice. "Your presence achieved that. What happens next is determined by what those materials contain and who ends up holding them." "Tell me why Ghost Wing was sacrificed." A pause, the kind that precedes a decision to speak because speaking has become, in some calculation, less risky than silence. American hypersonic weapons technology was transferred to a foreign state actor through channels that bypassed conventional authorization. When that technology appeared in the foreign state's arsenal, the transfer required an explanation that would not trace back to the authorizing parties. His aim did not waver. Ghost Wing's surveillance operation had developed intelligence that, if it had reached normal reporting channels, would have identified the transfer and its authorization source. The squadron was redirected into an environment where hostile forces had been prepositioned. The transfer intelligence died with your pilots. The official account became a classified operational failure attributed to equipment compromise. The clinical precision of the explanation was somehow worse than anger would have been. And Forsyth discovered the authorization documentation before the mission was executed. Too late to prevent Ghost Wing's deployment, he attempted to reach your father's chain of command contacts and found those channels had already been managed. He preserved what evidence he could and made himself unavailable before the institutional response reached him. Something in Harlan's voice shifted, a fractional change in register. Forsyth has been a persistent operational liability for 3 years. He's alive. Inconveniently. The combat sounds from the corridor outside the vault had been building for the past 2 minutes, not the organized response of base security, but the tactically precise movement of a small unit clearing positions in sequence. Harlan registered it. His weight shifted slightly, redistributing to accommodate a threat from the entrance as well as the subject in front of him. "Whatever you believe about my position in this," he said, "the materials in that case cannot leave this facility in unauthorized hands. The people who authorized Ghost Wing's sacrifice have institutional resources that extend beyond any single investigation or congressional inquiry. The most that evidence can do, in the wrong hands, is get the people holding it killed. And in the right hands, that," said a voice from the vault entrance, "is the variable we've spent 3 years working toward." Gerald Ashby came through the threshold with 4 operators behind him. They moved to flanking positions with the economical precision of people who had rehearsed this room's layout before entering it. Their equipment carried identification markers invisible to standard recognition, the embedded designation of a specific task force operating under congressional oversight authority rather than normal military command structure. Harlan recalibrated his aim toward the new threat. His expression showed the calculation of a man assessing whether the tactical math still worked. "Lower the weapon, Harlan," Ashby said. "Pentagon Authorization 7 Gamma was confirmed 4 minutes ago. Direct oversight authority. The Zodiac containment framework has been suspended." "On whose initiation?" "On the initiation of the Select Intelligence Oversight Committee, acting on evidence submitted through protected channels over the past 18 months. Ashby held his position. "You are currently documented on 3 sets of surveillance records in this facility. Lower the weapon." The standoff lasted 8 seconds. Then Harlan lowered the sidearm with the measured compliance of a man who was surrendering a position, not a principle. He understood when a battle had moved to ground where a different kind of fighting was required. 2 of Ashby's operators took custody of Harlan immediately, securing his weapon and moving him to the corridor under guard. He did not resist. He would save his resources for the coming process, which he understood better than most people in the room. Diana held the Ghost Wing case and watched the space where the confrontation had been. "You've been working with Forsyth since before I arrived at Stonegate," she said. "Since approximately 4 months after Ghost Wing disappeared." Ashby crossed to her, keeping his voice low despite the changed tactical situation. "Thomas's encoded message told me where to look and approximately what I would find. Forsyth had already gone underground by the time I began. We established contact through legacy channels, systems the current monitoring infrastructure doesn't cover because they were supposed to have been decommissioned. The same channels he used to activate the vault." "Yes, tonight's sequence was coordinated. The vault activation forced the institutional response, Pentagon involvement, base lockdown, the convergence of everyone relevant to this situation into a space where the documentation in that case could be formally received by authorized oversight personnel. Ashby looked at the case in her hands. Thomas preserved that evidence. Forsyth secured it here. 3 years of waiting for the moment when it could surface, without being destroyed in the process. She looked at the ghost wing emblem on the case. Scorched, oxidized, still recognizable. What happens now? The documentation is received into formal oversight custody. The Select Committee's investigation, which has been proceeding in parallel to everything you and I have been doing here, now has the physical evidence to match its existing record of digital and testimony-based materials. He met her eyes. Harlan will face charges. The officers above Harlan in the authorization chain, the individuals who approved the technology transfer and authorized Ghost Wing's sacrifice, will be subjects of a formal congressional investigation. That process will take time. It will be contested. It will be managed by people on both sides who understand exactly what is at stake. It won't be clean. It will not be clean, but it will be real, and it will be documented, and it will not go away. He paused. Your name is cleared as of the moment I received authorization confirmation. The administrative record will be corrected. You'll receive a commendation for actions taken under exceptional circumstances. She was quiet for a moment. And Ghost Wing, the pilots. We have strong intelligence indicators that the initial ambush did not achieve complete results. Survival scenarios exist for at least 3 members of the squadron beyond yourself. He spoke carefully, every word placed with deliberate precision. Official search and recovery operations closed the file. Unofficial indicators were classified and quarantined. What I can tell you is that certain communication patterns we have monitored over the past 18 months are consistent with the survival and active concealment of military-trained individuals in the border region where Ghost Wing's final mission was executed. They're alive. The evidence suggests that is a possibility that was deliberately suppressed rather than genuinely resolved. She looked at the chronograph in her hand. Her father's watch, a credential he had carried for 30 years without ever telling her what it was, because what it was had required this room, this moment, and a daughter who would know what to do when the door was finally in front of her. I need to know where they are, she said. Ashby looked at her for a long moment. That conversation, he said carefully, needs to happen somewhere other than here. General Robert Caldwell arrived at the Stonegate Command Center from Washington within 12 hours of the vault's opening, which told Diana everything she needed to know about how closely the events of the previous night had been monitored by people several layers above Stonegate's command structure. He came to the secure briefing room where she had been waiting, the Ghost Wing case on the table between them, the weight of everything it contained making the room feel smaller than its dimensions. He was immaculate despite the travel, silver-haired and square-shouldered, with the compressed precision of a man who had spent 40 years controlling what his face showed and had become very good at it. He studied her for a moment before he sat. She remained seated when he entered, a small, deliberate choice that established the nature of this conversation before either of them spoke. Project Zodiac was operational before my direct authority over the relevant programs, he began. The research parameters exceeded what any treaty-compliant development framework would have permitted. By the time I had visibility into the program's legacy operations, the technology transfer had already been authorized, and the institutional protective structure around it was established. Ghost Wing was killed to protect that structure. The operational decision was made by individuals whose authority at the time of execution exceeded mine. He held her gaze. I want to be precise about that, because the investigation that is now underway will require precision. You knew it wasn't pilot error. You knew when you sat across from me in that interrogation room. A long pause. I knew the official account was incomplete. His voice carried something she had not heard in it before, not regret exactly, but the quality of a man choosing words because the inaccurate ones would be worse than silence. I did not have verified access to the full authorization chain at that time. I made a decision to proceed with the institutional response while pursuing verification through separate channels. You left me in that room. Yes. The single word sat between them. He did not expand on it. She did not expect him to. The oversight investigation, she said. How far does it reach? It will reach as far as the evidence in that case, and the supplementary record compiled by the Oversight Committee permits it to reach. He leaned forward slightly. The individuals at the authorization apex of Ghost Wing's sacrifice are not protected by the same institutional insulation that has protected this program for 3 decades. The technology transfer, specifically, violates statutory frameworks that carry personal criminal exposure regardless of the national security context, invoked to justify it. She absorbed this, Harlan. Harlan will be prosecuted. His cooperation with the investigation will determine the scope of what else becomes accessible through formal process. Caldwell's expression shifted, not softening exactly, but opening slightly, as if something practiced and maintained was being set aside for a moment. Harlan was not the architect. He was a capable operator executing a framework designed by people who understood that the further removed an operation is from its authorization, the more deniable it becomes. He knew that. He accepted those terms. And those people are the subject of an active congressional investigation with the kind of evidentiary foundation that makes simple denial unavailable. He met her eyes. That is the most precise answer I can give you right now. I recognize it is insufficient. What it is, she said carefully, is a beginning. Caldwell nodded. Something in the gesture was heavier than agreement. The acknowledgement of a man who understood that what was beginning would require sustained effort from many people over a long time, and that the outcome was not guaranteed. Your record has been corrected, he said, returning to the operational register. The administrative leave designation, the implied suspicion, all of it removed. A commendation for exceptional service under extreme circumstances has been entered. Your promotion to major is confirmed effective today. I've received transfer orders. Pentagon Strategic Command, reporting to General Morrison, a posting appropriate to your capabilities. He paused. The assignment also places you within the institutional structure relevant to the ongoing investigation. Your knowledge of Zodiac's operational history and your direct experience of Ghost Wing's compromise are assets that the oversight process needs access to. I want to know about the surviving pilots before I accept any assignment. The question had been sitting under every other exchange in the room, and they both knew it. Caldwell was still for several seconds. His next words were measured more carefully than anything else he had said. Official search and recovery operations were conducted in accordance with standard protocols. Those operations concluded without confirmed survivors. He paused. Subsequent intelligence has produced indicators that are inconsistent with total loss. Those indicators were classified at a level that placed them outside the normal recovery operations review framework. Another pause. I will tell you, Captain. I will tell you precisely this. The operational decision to classify those indicators rather than pursue them was made by individuals within the same authorization structure responsible for Ghost Wing's redirection. It was not a resource limitation. It was a calculated decision. She held the watch on the table in front of her, turning it slowly. "My father served Zodiac from the inside," she said. "He objected to what it became and stayed anyway because he believed internal presence gave him more ability to influence it than walking away would have." That is an accurate characterization. Did it give him more ability to influence it? Caldwell was quiet for long enough that she understood the answer was more complicated than the question allowed for. "Your father preserved the authentication architecture that opened that vault tonight. He registered you as a derivative credential in 1994, when you were 2 years old, without any record of having done so in any documentation connected to his name. A beat. He understood, I believe, that the program would outlast his ability to influence it from within. He made certain that if his daughter ever found herself standing at the right door, she would have the key." She looked at the watch for a long moment. Then she placed it on her wrist, properly, the crown at 3 o'clock, the way her father had always worn it. "I want access to the intelligence indicators on the surviving pilots," she said, "before I sign anything." Caldwell reached into his jacket and placed a sealed folder on the table. That folder contains everything the official record holds. It also contains contact information for an individual operating outside official channels who has more current information than the official record reflects. She opened the folder. The name inside was not a surprise. Raymond Forsyth. The secure communication system in the briefing room activated 3 hours after Caldwell left. A legacy channel transmission. The authorization headers carrying the specific formatting of a system that had officially been decommissioned in 2003 and was apparently still in daily use by at least one person. The message was brief. "Not all who vanish are lost. Some operate beyond official parameters. Coordinates follow for those who remember the obligation to recover personnel regardless of political calculation." Below the text, precise coordinates, a border region in Eastern Europe, a contact window 46 hours from transmission time, recognition protocols. She read it twice, then she went to find Ashby. She found him in the base's small secure communications annex, running something on a terminal that he closed unhurriedly when she entered. He looked at her face and understood immediately. "Forsyth," he said. 46-hour window." He leaned back in his chair and studied her for a moment. The Select Committee's authorization for the vault operation included a secondary mandate I haven't mentioned yet. Classified reconnaissance and recovery assessment in the relevant border region, under special access protocol, rather than standard military operations authority. The authorization is real. The operational framework allows for activities that would otherwise require a chain of approvals that would take months. She understood the architecture. You've had this ready since the vault operations planning phase. Forsyth was certain the documentation would produce a window. He was less certain of the timing. Ashby met her eyes. "I have a team assembled. Transport available from the auxiliary airfield at 400. The operational window Forsyth has identified is the best intelligence we have on survivor location. If we're going to move on it, we move now." She thought of 6 voices on a comms channel. Thought of the precise accounting, 3 years, 2 months, 17 days, that a pilot with military discipline would keep even in unofficial status in hostile territory. "I'll be at the airfield at 3:45, she said. "Brief me in the air." The transport flew low and without running lights, navigating by terrain contour rather than direct approach. The pilot was one of Ashby's people, not a word offered or apparently needed. The 4-person team in the cargo bay maintained the contained alertness of operators who were conserving focus for what came next. The operational briefing filled the first hour of the flight. Ashby's intelligence picture on the surviving Ghost wing pilots had been assembled from fragments, signals intercepts, pattern analysis, a network of non-official contacts in the border region whose cooperation had been cultivated through prior classified operations. The picture was incomplete but directionally consistent. 3 pilots, compromised health conditions from untreated injuries, operational since their survival by the grace of local infrastructure that had no reason to cooperate and had done so anyway. The local support network, Diana said. How? Your father's work in the region extended beyond Zodiac's formal parameters. He developed relationships during classified operations in the early 90s that were never officially documented. Those relationships have been maintained informally by people who understood what Frank Hartwell represented and extended the same consideration to personnel associated with him when the need arose. Ashby paused. Forsyth knew about the network. He established contact with them in the first month after Ghost Wing's ambush. Another thing her father had done without telling her. Another key placed where it would be needed. The landing zone was a natural clearing in mature forest, the kind of terrain that absorbs an aircraft's sound quickly and returns to silence faster than its occupants expect. The team deployed to perimeter security, while Diana and the team leader completed an initial assessment of the approach corridors. No sign of activity within visual range. The forest was patient. At the designated contact time, a figure emerged from the tree line 200 meters north. Military bearing in civilian clothing, the posture of someone who had maintained physical discipline through years of extraordinary circumstances. Moving with the careful deliberateness of a person who had learned not to assume anything about any approaching group. Diana recognized Raymond Forsyth from 50 meters. Time and exposure had changed him, more gray in the beard, more vigilance in the eyes, the specific kind of weathering that comes from sustained operational existence without institutional support. But the intelligence behind his expression was unchanged. The precision, the sense of a man who had been thinking 12 moves ahead for 3 years and had not miscounted once. Recognition Protocol Hotel Sierra 7-9er. Authentication acknowledged. Extraction team on site. His relief was controlled, a soldier's expression, the kind that registers something significant without becoming it. 3 personnel awaiting confirmation of extraction capability. Request immediate departure once all parties are recovered. Who survived? Lieutenant Kevin Park, Captain James Delgado, Lieutenant Sarah Monroe. 3 names that had been listed as presumed dead for 3 years, 1 month, and 26 days. Forsyth activated a short-range signal device. 4 minutes later, 3 figures emerged from the forest's cover, moving with the qualified precision of people whose bodies had been compromised, but whose training had not. Park walked with the gait compensation of a badly healed leg fracture. Delgado's right arm was held at an angle that indicated shoulder damage beyond field treatment capacity. Monroe moved with the protective posture of someone managing ongoing rib or internal injury. They looked at her, she looked at them. 3 years and the length of a forest clearing separated the moment from the last time she had heard their voices on a combat frequency. Kevin Park had been Ghost 3, 28 years old when they deployed, the youngest pilot in the squadron, the one who had quoted Sun Tzu in pre-mission briefings with complete earnestness and no apparent irony. James Delgado had been Ghost 5, 18-year Air Force career, the kind of pilot other pilots watched to understand how to make a difficult maneuver look obvious. Sarah Monroe had been Ghost 6, 300 combat hours, a precision instrument approach record that the instructors at Nelly's still used in training. Captain, Park said. His voice was rougher than she remembered. 3 years of cold and exposure and the particular toll of existing without being allowed to exist. Extraction confirmed. 3 years, 1 month, 26 days, unofficial status. The counting, the precise accounting, the military discipline maintained through everything. "Let's go home," Diana said. On the aircraft, while the medical specialist worked through initial assessment and treatment with each of the 3 survivors, Forsyth sat across from Diana and told her the rest. The locator beacons activated on schedule. Standard survival protocol, 4 continuous hours from ejection confirmation. He spoke without inflection, the way people speak about facts they have processed until the emotion has been worn down to something manageable. Search aircraft were in the region within the correct window. I monitored their approach vectors. They flew systematic patterns that deliberately avoided our beacon coordinates. It wasn't navigation error. They had our positions, and they chose different positions. She had known this. The intelligence picture had implied it. Hearing it from someone who had watched it happen was different. We established contact with the local support network on day 3. Forsyth had prior knowledge of the network's existence through his classified operational history in the region. He reached them before his own extraction was available. We confirmed what his earlier pronoun usage had implied. Forsyth had been coordinating with the survivor group from very early in the event. Medical support, shelter, communication security. The network understood what was at stake and chose to act on the side of the obligation, rather than the institutional calculation. Why didn't you surface earlier? Find a way to reach official channels through a third party. We tried, twice in the first year, through channels we believed were outside the compromise structure. His expression was the flattest she had seen it. Both attempts produced responses consistent with our position being reported rather than actioned. After the second attempt, we understood that official channels were not viable for recovery. The only path was the one that eventually led here. Building a case strong enough that its formal reception could not be prevented by the same people who had managed the institutional response to Ghost Wing. The vault. The vault was always the terminal point. The documentation inside it was assembled by Thomas Ashby and myself over the course of Ghost Wing's operational period, when the anomalies in our mission parameters became too specific to explain as coincidence. We preserved it in a location where the same people who had compromised our missions could not access or destroy it without triggering the very exposure they were trying to prevent. He looked at his hands for a moment. 3 years is a long time to wait for a plan's terminal phase. Thomas, she said, he knew before the final mission. He told me 3 days before the mission that he had documented everything he needed and placed it where he intended. He told me that if things went wrong, Gerald would find the right path. Forsyth looked out the small window at the darkness below. Thomas was right about his brother. Diana held her father's watch. The aircraft's vibration was steady. The team settled into the focused calm of an operation in its final phase. Forsyth, she waited until he looked at her. My father, did he know what Zodiac would become? He knew what it was. He objected to specific applications of the technology, the ones that crossed from deterrence into offensive first-strike capability, and later the ones that approached treaty violation. Forsyth paused. Frank was a pragmatist about institutions. He believed that presence inside a flawed system gave you more leverage than principled withdrawal. He was correct about that, I think, as a general principle. Where he was wrong, where all of us were wrong, was in the assumption that the institution's self-correcting mechanisms would eventually catch what was happening. He met her eyes. He registered you as a derivative credential because he understood that the institution might not correct itself in time, and someone would need a key that the institution didn't know existed. She turned the watch over in her hands. her father's wrist for decades. The scratched case, the luminous hands reading the correct time in the quiet of a transport aircraft over contested air, carrying inside its case back a piece of metal smaller than a thumbnail that had opened a door 30 years in the making. "He trusted me with something he couldn't explain to me," she said. "He trusted you with the consequences of his choices. That's a different kind of trust than explanation." Forsyth was quiet for a moment. He was right, too. The secure facility that received them operated under congressional oversight authority rather than standard military command structure, a distinction that mattered in ways both administrative and practical. The Oversight Committee's physical reception of the vault documentation, the survivor testimony, and the intercepted communications record compiled over 3 years created a formal evidentiary record that existed outside the management reach of the institutional structure that had protected Zodiac's legacy operations. Harlan was in custody, awaiting the formal charge process. His attorney, appointed within hours of his detention, had already begun the preliminary cooperation conversations that Caldwell had predicted. The specific nature of Harlan's cooperation would shape the scope of what the investigation could reach. The authorization chain above him was not his alone to protect, and the people at its apex understood by now that Harlan's calculation would reflect his own interests. The 3 surviving pilots were in medical care. Park's leg fracture had healed crookedly and would require surgical correction, the kind of procedure that restores full function in the majority of cases. Delgado's shoulder damage was extensive but within the range of reconstructive repair. Monroe's internal injuries had been managed through the survivor period by a combination of local medical support and extraordinary personal discipline. The full assessment was ongoing, but the preliminary picture was not what it could have been. Their official status was being processed through the Oversight Committee's administrative authority, a mechanism designed specifically to handle situations where standard military personnel records required correction under circumstances that the standard system could not acknowledge. Their deaths would be formally rescinded. Their service records would reflect the complete and accurate account of their survival. There would be no public announcement in the near term, for reasons connected to the ongoing investigation, but there would be a record that could not be erased. Diana stood in a small outdoor area adjacent to the facility, a concrete courtyard, trees visible above the perimeter wall, the first natural daylight she had seen in what felt like several consecutive lifetimes. She held her father's watch and did not check the time. Ashby found her there. He looked tired in the way that comes from sustained operational pressure rather than a single sleepless night, a deep tiredness that would not be resolved by one good rest but would require weeks of ordinary life to address. "Forsyth's status," she said. "He will be formally received by the Oversight Committee as a protected witness under the Congressional Investigation Framework. His operational activities since his disappearance will be reviewed under the specific authority that authorizes certain classified operations, conducted without standard chain-of-command approval when normal channels are demonstrably compromised." Ashby chose his words carefully. "He will not be prosecuted for the activities he undertook to preserve the evidence and sustain the survivors. That determination has been made at the committee level. His service record will be corrected to reflect the full history. The retirement he submitted was coerced, documented as such in Thomas's preserved record. His reinstatement to active status is an option available to him if he wants it." Ashby paused. "He told me this morning that he intends to retire, properly, this time on his own terms. He asked me to tell you that he considers the account with your father's memory settled." She absorbed this, the people above Harlan. "The investigation is proceeding. The evidentiary foundation is strong enough that simple denial is not available to the individuals at the authorization apex. Criminal exposure exists for the technology transfer specifically. Several of the relevant statutes carry personal liability that cannot be deflected by national security invocation. Ashby met her eyes. I won't tell you the outcome is certain. These processes are contested and slow, and they operate against significant resistance. What I can tell you is that the evidence is now formally in the hands of people whose institutional interest is accountability rather than protection, and that it is documented in a form that cannot be made to disappear. It'll take years. Yes, and it will not produce the kind of clean resolution that the scale of the wrong seems to demand. He held her gaze. But it will be real, and the pilots of Ghost Wing will be in that record, their names, their service, their survival, and the truth of what was done to them, not in a classified annex, in the formal account. She looked at the trees above the perimeter wall. The light was ordinary morning light, the kind that exists regardless of what has happened underneath it. My father would have considered this a partial victory, she said. What would you consider it? She thought about Kevin Park's precise accounting. 3 years, 1 month, 26 days. Thought about Sarah Monroe's posture in the forest clearing, the protective angle that meant pain managed through will over a sustained period. Thought about James Delgado's shoulder and the 18-year career that had been lived in unofficial suspension in hostile territory rather than the cockpit where it belonged. I'd consider it a beginning, she said, with work remaining. There is always work remaining. She put the watch on her wrist. When does the Oversight Committee want my formal testimony? Tomorrow morning, 1400. Then I have this afternoon. She looked at him. I want to see them. Park, Delgado, Monroe, not as a debrief, just I want to see them. They asked for you this morning, Ashby said, before the medical team would let any of us through. She walked back inside. The medical wing of the oversight facility was quiet in the way of rooms where people are being carefully maintained. 3 doors down a corridor from the reception area, Diana found them together. Someone had arranged for the 3 recovered pilots to share a room rather than be separated, which struck her as the most humane logistical decision that had been made on behalf of Ghost Wing in approximately 3 years. Kevin Park was sitting up in the bed nearest the window, his leg in an external fixation device that the surgical team had applied in preparation for the corrective procedure scheduled for the following week. He was thinner than she remembered, and his face carried the particular quality of someone who has existed without adequate rest for so long that alertness has become a chronic state rather than a chosen one. He looked at her when she came through the door, and his expression did the thing that military faces do when they are registering something that matters, a slight settling, as if a tension that has been maintained for a very long time has been informed. It can release at some point in the near future. James Delgado was in the far bed, his shoulder immobilized in a positioning brace, reading something on a tablet with his left hand. He set it down without being asked. 3 years of living outside official structures had not removed the reflexive attention to a senior officer entering a room. Some things go too deep to be worn away. Sarah Monroe was in the middle bed, her posture held carefully upright in the way of someone whose torso was currently telling her a story she was choosing to ignore. She had the look of a person who had arrived at a particular kind of clarity, not peace exactly, but the quality that comes from having done a difficult thing for a long time and completed it. She studied Diana with the directness of someone who had nothing to manage impressions for. Diana stood in the doorway for a moment. "You look terrible," Park said, "sir." She laughed. It was genuine and it arrived before she could manage it, and she did not try to manage it afterward. "You look worse." "Fair," he said. We've had a rougher 3 years. She pulled the room's single chair to a position between the three beds and sat down. Not a debrief posture, not a command visit. Just four people who had survived something together and were in the same room for the first time since it happened. "I want to hear it from you," she said. "Not the official version, not the intake records, from you." They told her. It took 2 hours and none of them stopped in the middle. The ambush, the specific moment when the tactical picture had clarified from emergency into something more deliberate. The ejections, the scattered landing zones, the first hours of working toward each other through terrain that did not want to be traversed. Park's leg, broken in the ejection sequence, managed by improvised splinting that had held through circumstances it was never designed for. Monroe's rib fractures, 3 of them, and the internal bruising that had remained a managed concern, rather than a crisis through the intervention of local medical knowledge that no official program had authorized, and that no official record would reflect. Delgado's shoulder, partially dislocated in the landing, and never fully corrected in field conditions. The 14 days of monitoring official search frequencies. The precise coordinates of the search aircraft's approach vectors, recorded and preserved, because people with flight training do not stop being precise observers when the official structure stops supporting them. The decision, after the second failed contact attempt in the first year, to commit fully to the long plan, to become, in effect, a classified self-sustaining unit operating toward a single objective. The surfacing of sufficient evidence to make their recovery politically unavoidable rather than politically inconvenient. "Forsyth kept us functional," Monroe said at one point. "Not just operationally. He understood what 3 years of this does to a person. He was very deliberate about that." "He thought about you specifically," Delgado said, looking at Diana. "He talked about you more than about anyone else. He said Frank Hartwell's daughter would find the door. He said it with the certainty of someone who had thought it through rather than hoped for it." She held the watch. The room was quiet. "I'm sorry it took 3 years," she said. The words were insufficient. She said them anyway because insufficient acknowledgement is better than the silence that pretends the weight of 3 years can be left unaddressed. "You came," Park said simply. "When the system said there was no one to come for, you came." The weight of it was not simple. It was the weight of what military service is supposed to mean when it is working as it is supposed to work. The obligation that runs laterally through a unit, wingman to wingman, independent of the institutional authority that may or may not honor it. The principle that predates any specific chain of command and survives the failure of any specific institutional structure. She stayed for another hour. They talked about things that were not the mission, about what Park intended to do with the leg once the surgery was complete. "Fly, obviously," he said, as if the answer were a geographical fact. About Monroe's family, who did not yet know she was alive and would be notified within the next 48 hours through a process the Oversight Committee had established for exactly this situation. About Delgado's shoulder and the 18-year career that had been suspended mid-flight by circumstances beyond his control, and what 18 years of service entitled a person to when the institutional structure had failed in its most basic function. She did not stay until they needed to sleep. She said goodbye at the door and meant it in the full sense, goodbye as recognition that this specific configuration of people in this specific room was a moment worth marking. That whatever came next, which would be complicated and slow and imperfect in the ways that coming next always is, this room was real and complete and not available to be taken back by anyone. She walked down the corridor holding her father's watch and understood something she had not had language for since the interrogation room at Ramstein, that the difference between a mission and a purpose is that a mission ends. What her father had given her was not a mission. It was a purpose, and it had required everything she was to carry it this far, and it was not finished. She was glad it was not finished. The formal testimony before the Select Intelligence Oversight Committee occupied most of the following day. 3 committee members present, 2 attending via secure video connection. The committee's chief counsel conducting the examination with the careful precision of someone who understood that the record being created would be referenced in proceedings that might last years. Diana gave her account without gaps or qualifications she could not support. The Ghost Wing mission, the redirect, the ambush, the interrogation at Ramstein, Stonegate, the archive, the vault. She spoke about Harlan's statements in the vault with the precision that came from having replayed them multiple times since they were made. She spoke about Forsyth's account in the aircraft with the same precision. When the examination reached the question of the individuals who had authorized the technology transfer and directed Ghost Wing's sacrifice above Harlan's level, she gave the names she had. The committee counsel received each name without visible reaction, which told her the names were not new to the record. The committee chair, a woman in her late 60s with the measured authority of someone who had been doing this work long enough to know exactly how much she could move and how much she could not, spoke directly to Diana at the conclusion of the testimony. What you have provided today, combined with the documentary evidence recovered from Vault Omega and the testimony of the other surviving personnel, creates a formal record that will support proceedings against multiple individuals at multiple levels of authority. I want to be honest with you about the timeline and the outcome. These proceedings will be long. They will be contested by well-resourced opposition. Some of the individuals implicated will find procedural shelter that allows them to avoid full accountability for what was done. She held Diana's eyes. What I can tell you is that this record exists, that it is in the formal custody of an oversight authority whose mandate is specifically to address exactly this kind of failure, and that the names of the Ghost Wing squadron are now permanently in that record as people who were deliberately sacrificed, survived that sacrifice, and came back to tell it truthfully. No future administration, no future classification review, no future management of the national security apparatus removes what is now formally documented. Diana sat with this for a moment. Thank you for saying it plainly. It's the minimum you're owed. The committee chair gathered her materials, and Captain Major, the record will also reflect your conduct throughout this process. Stonegate wanted to bury you. You went looking for the truth instead. A pause that carried weight. Your father would have recognized the choice. 6 weeks later, the wall of remembrance in Stonegate's West Wing had been updated. The photographs of the 7 Ghost Wing pilots remained. They had not been removed when the official record was corrected, because what they memorialized was real regardless of the correction. The fact that 7 people had flown into a situation from which they should never have returned, and had survived it through a combination of training and will, and the support of people who refused to accept the institutional accounting. Beneath the photograph, the squadron badge Diana had placed on the night of the vault operation was still there. She had been told it would be kept. She stood in front of the photograph for the last time before her transfer to Washington. Park, Delgado, and Monroe had been formally reinstated to active status. Thomas Ashby's name, Ghost 2, had been entered into the record with the full account of his role in preserving the evidence that had made everything else possible. Ghost 4 through 7, the 3 pilots whose ejections had not produced survival scenarios the local network could reach, had been formally recognized with the complete account of their service and the circumstances of their deaths. They were no longer a classified operational failure. They were named, and the record of what had been done to them was named beside them. Forsyth had submitted his retirement paperwork. Properly this time, the coerced version formally voided and replaced. He had last been reachable through a contact in the region where Ghost Wing survivors had been sustained, which Diana interpreted as a choice. A man who had spent 3 years building a case toward a single terminal outcome and had earned the right to spend whatever came next wherever he chose. Ashby had accepted assignment to the Oversight Committee's operational support structure, a position whose specific duties did not need to be described in publicly available documentation, and whose significance was clear from the fact that the committee chair had asked for him personally. Diana fastened her father's watch on her wrist and straightened her uniform in the reflection of the memorial wall's glass. 3 years, 1 month, 26 days. Park's voice. She had learned since the recovery operation that he had maintained a journal for the entire duration, written in the kind of shorthand that military pilots develop for the limited paper and writing instruments available in improvised conditions. The journal documented everything: the survival period, the intelligence they had gathered about the border region's military activity, the failed contact attempts, the support network, Forsyth's operational decisions. 347 pages that would contribute to the Oversight Committee's record and to Park's own account of what he had experienced, which he had indicated he intended to write in full eventually, when the words were ready. He had asked Diana what she intended to do with her account. She had said she didn't know yet. She thought, standing in front of the photograph, that she would know when the investigation had reached whatever resolution it was going to reach, when she understood enough of the ending to write from it. Some stories require the full shape before they can be told properly. She took one last look at the faces she had flown with. Then she walked toward the door and the transfer that waited and the work that was not finished. The flight to Washington was unremarkable. She sat in a standard commercial seat, no cargo transport, no mission equipment, just a window seat in an ordinary aircraft carrying ordinary passengers who had no interest in the person beside them. The Pentagon complex appeared below as they descended, the familiar pentagonal geometry, the roads and rivers, and the accumulated gravity of everything that had been decided in and around that building for 80 years. She thought, as the wheels touched down, about her father's watch and what it had been for all those years. A credential disguised as a keepsake, a key that looked like a gift. She thought about the 1994 registration, the 2-year-old daughter whose name had been placed in a Cold War security architecture, against the possibility that the architecture would survive longer than the people who had built it. He had not been wrong. The cab from the airport moved through the familiar geography of a city she had not visited in over a year. Traffic was ordinary. People on the sidewalks had their ordinary business. The sky above the Potomac was the specific shade of late afternoon that belongs to late autumn in the mid-Atlantic, clear enough to see a long distance, the kind of visibility that combat pilots describe as ideal conditions. She had a meeting in the morning. The Oversight Committee, General Morrison's office in the afternoon, a long week ahead and a long process and no clean ending in sight. She found she did not need the clean ending as much as she had expected to. Park, Delgado, and Monroe were alive. Forsyth had his retirement wherever he was. Thomas Ashby's account would be in the formal record. The people who had authorized Ghost Wing's sacrifice were named, on record, in the custody of an authority whose job was to do something with names. The cab pulled up to the hotel the Pentagon had booked for her. She paid, got out, stood for a moment on the sidewalk with her single bag and her father's watch, and the early darkness of November settling over the city. Then she went inside. A note from the author. Friends, if you've stayed with Diana Hartwell all the way to this page, then you already know this story is not really about missiles, vaults, or classified files. Those are the pressure. What the pressure reveals is the story. At its heart, this is about what happens when the institution you gave your life to asks you to be grateful for half the truth. Diana doesn't rage against the machine. She learns its language, masters its codes literally, as it turns out, and uses every bit of that knowledge to do the one thing no one in the system calculated for. She goes back for her people. I've thought a lot in writing this about the generation of Americans who lived the Cold War not as history, but as present-tense reality. The compartmentalization was real. The understanding that some sacrifices would never be publicly acknowledged was real. The men and women who served in that framework, who knew what they carried and chose to carry it anyway, deserve stories that take that weight seriously, not stories that treat classified sacrifice as thriller backdrop. Frank Hartwell is my attempt to honor that generation, someone who knew the system was imperfect and chose to work within it because he believed presence gave him more ability to change it than walking away would have. He wasn't entirely right. He also wasn't entirely wrong. And then there is the watch. I've received more correspondence about that watch than about any other element of everything I've written. I think I understand why. It is not a gadget. It is a conversation across time between a father and a daughter, one that Frank Hartwell never got to have out loud because having it out loud would have required telling her things he wasn't authorized to tell. So he did what people with certain kinds of love and certain kinds of obligation do. He made sure she would have what she needed without being able to explain why. He trusted her to find the door when it was time. A lot of us have given or received exactly that kind of trust in one form or another. Not always a watch, not always something this consequential, but the structure of it, the love that prepares rather than protects, that trusts rather than shields, is something most of us recognize from our own lives if we're honest about them. Kevin Park's 3 years, 1 month, 26 days. That detail came from thinking about what military discipline actually is, not the imposed kind, not the performative kind, but the kind that becomes a person's internal structure over years of practice. A pilot with that kind of discipline doesn't stop keeping precise account of things just because the official record has stopped. The counting is not obsession. It is identity. It is the refusal to accept that time spent outside the official accounting doesn't count. It counts. That is the argument of this entire book, stated as simply as I know how to state it. For those of you who wrote to me after the previous version of this story asking whether Diana would ever find her people, here is your answer. She found them. It took everything she had, it cost her the career she thought she was building, and it required her to discover that the career she was actually building was something different and larger than what she had been told to want. That, too, is something many of us recognize. Thank you for flying this one with her. The work isn't finished, and neither is she. Until next time, trust your instruments, know your people, and never leave a wingman behind.